Hello, everyone, and welcome to this podcast introduction to Listening to America with Clay Jenkinson. I had a great conversation with my friend David Nicandri, who is the author of several books on Lewis and Clark, including one that really won critical acclaim, River of Promise, Lewis and Clark on the Columbia, and a book called Captain Cook Rediscovered about the third voyage, which Nicandri believes has been misunderstood. In this conversation, we talked about the Endurance, Shackleton's ship that sank the South Atlantic in the Arctic to 10,000 feet of water. This is the famous Shackleton voyage in which they were stranded, but nobody died. It was a story of incredible pluck and courage and perseverance and great leadership and so on. And a man named Menson Bound is a professional wreck archaeologist, finds ships under the sea. And this is sort of the mother ship, the mother lode. And he wrote a book about it called The Ship Beneath the Ice, cast in the form of a journal, which makes it very interesting. The full title is The Ship Beneath the Ice, The Discoveries of Shackleton's Endurance. An amazing story. I've never been to Antarctica. I've never been to the Arctic. Nicandri has been with his son, Dominic, and they're going soon to Saskatchewan. They're doing father-son trips into the outback of Canada and the Arctic, which is really a terrific thing. As you all know, David Nicandri is one of my oldest friends. We met long ago at the Western History Association, I think in Oregon. We've known each other ever since. He's the retired executive director of the Washington State Historical Society. He's been a frequent guest on the Jefferson Hour, and we often meet at Lochsaw Lodge in the retreats that we do there. You'll notice that this is one of the first official programs under the new rubric, Listening to America with Clay Jenkinson. The Jefferson Hour is no more, although there will be more continuity than not. Continuing conversations with Lindsay Chervinsky, continuing conversations with Joseph Ellis, talk about Jefferson, every new thing that comes out about Jefferson, every new book published about Jefferson, my own musings about Thomas Jefferson. So there will be more continuity than not, but this allows us a wider lens. We'll be publishing our results. I've already written a number of the pieces, and they'll appear at ltamerica.org, ltamerica.org. So let's go to the show. If you want to devote funds or any other contributions to the Listening to America initiative, thank you so much. I think the program is going to get better and better and better and better and better. And so let's go now to David Nicandri. Thanks for listening. Hello, everyone, and welcome to this special edition of Listening to America with Clay Jenkinson. I'm in Missoula, Montana, with my friend David Nicandri of the state of Washington. We're at the annual Lewis and Clark Trail Heritage Conference this year in Missoula, always somewhere on the Lewis and Clark Trail. We come as observers, not to be speaking this year. And we've discovered over the past week that we are both fascinated by what happened to the Ocean Gate submersible, the Titan, at the bottom of the Atlantic Ocean, only 1,600 feet from the hull of the Titanic. So welcome, Dave.
Good morning, Clay. Good to be with you as always.
I don't quite remember where I was when I heard the news, but the minute I heard that it was missing, and they were talking about whether there was enough oxygen, and whether a rescue would even be possible, and what could have gone wrong, and why people do this sort of thing, two things came to me. First, I've got to get Nicandri, because this is exactly the world that you like to think about too. And secondly, I began to compare this with Lewis and Clark or with the American space program and so on. So I'm guessing you had immediately the sort of same instant reaction.
Exactly, Clay. Unlike a lot of things that come across our screens, I had no awareness that this venture was even going to be attempted.
I didn't know that such ventures were attempted.
Yes, and apparently there's a whole history to this, and maybe we can get to it. The founder of the company. The fact that the episode garnered as much attention is a phenomenon into itself, and I suspect that's why we're here to talk about it today. But I immediately began, as soon as I thought about all the parallels of exploration and or adventurism and thrill-seeking. I mean, these are the constituent parts that are at play here, and why the rescue attempt in some respect is controversial.
And, of course, you can't help but sort of hear the voice of William Shatner going where no man has gone before. That's not true. They were going where plenty of people have been.
Yes.
The Titanic turns out to be a huge tourism magnet, which I didn't really know. We'll come back to that. But that phrase, where no man has gone before, of course, comes from your man, Captain James Cook.
It's an adaptation from what Cook had said on his second voyage, that he had gone as far as it was conceivable for man to go, and popularized by Gene Roddenberry in the voice of William Shatner from the Star Trek episode opening. And in fact, the founder of Ocean Gate, a fellow by the name of Stockton Rush, I think.
Great name.
He was great name. He was a fan of Star Trek, not surprisingly. Wanted to be a flight test engineer. Maybe he was at one point, but aviation didn't quite work out, and so he turned to a new frontier. I mean, the associated comment in the Star Trek opening is exploring new frontiers, and I think this is actually the richer aspect we might discuss in our dialogue today is where does humanity go in terms of new frontiers? And with conventional perspective is we ought to be going into outer space. For better or worse, what the best you can say about Stockton Rush, and I think it's commendatory, is that he saw the the underwater environment as a frontier in itself. And that's what got him on this path and ultimately led to his demise.
When we think of the last terrestrial frontiers, it's deep ocean, that we know very little about the deep ocean. This would be an area that is still rich in possibility, and as we heard 5,000 times last week, Dave, it's an unforgiving world down there at that depth. I think it's 5,600 pounds per square inch of pressure.
Yes.
So the minute this submersible developed a fissure or a flaw,
was doomed.
The water apparently burst in with such explosive force that the men in the submersible wouldn't even have known it.
Yes.
They might have heard some creaking in the hour before, but they would not have experienced the catastrophe. And not to get too gross, I watched Fox, MSNBC, CNN, NPR, etc. And what you eventually learn, and they were being very discreet about it, is that their bodies were disintegrated to the point of turning to kind of a jelly.
Mush, yeah, exactly. It's kind of like a science fiction scene. What's interesting about this, the effect of the atmosphere, it plays on both the outer space and underwater. I mean, in deep space, there is no atmosphere. Under the water, too much. It's not atmospheric pressure, but it's the equivalent of a lot of pressure.
The medium is water and very dense.
Yes, and so the happy medium for humanity is on the surface.
It's the first 200 feet
yes,
in the ocean.
On the surface of the world. But you're right, I have made a note here. 240,000 of an estimated 2.2 million species have been cataloged under the ocean. Just a tiny, the lunar surface is better mapped than the oceanic surfaces.
So let's review. Ocean Gate Expeditions is the company, and it was developed as a tourism company. And as I understand it, there were 5 individuals on this excursion. About an 8 to 10 hour event in which you go down from the surface 13,000 feet into the depths of the ocean, and you will almost certainly see some portion of the wreckage of the Titanic, which went down in 1912, the most famous large ship sinking in human history.
You mean it wasn't Shackleton's Endurance?
Large ship. And as I understand it, each person pays about $250,000 for this. So father and son, Shahzada Dawood and Suleiman Dawood, were amongst the 5. They're Pakistani, wealthy. So that's $500,000 for that 8 to 10 hour experience. It's more than that. It's several days because there's have to get out there and then you do debriefings, and so it's a bigger package than that. The other people that were on board were Hamish Harding, who's a British businessman.
Billionaire, apparently.
Fascinating. He went down to Challenger Deep. He went down to the lowest point in the Mariana Trench.
Oh, I wasn't aware of that. Interesting.
Which is fascinating. He's done an amazing number of things. He flew over the South Pole, 2 excursions there, but he also flew the fastest trip from pole to pole, north to south, in an airplane. Then Paul-Henri Nargeolet, French, has been down there to the Titanic 35 times previously. We're meant to be historians of exploration. I knew that they had found the Titanic and that they had sent a few documentary film crews down and so on. I did not know any of this, that 5,000 objects have been brought to the surface. I did not know that there's an ongoing rescue mission, that there's a company that has exclusive rights to excavate, which bothers me some. And I certainly didn't know about deep sea tourism of the kind that came to light in this story. How much of this did you know?
Well, not much. I, of course, knew about the rediscovery of the Titanic. Wasn't familiar with all of these arrangements that you're now describing, though in the news coverage and just following up, I discovered some of it. The whole effort that played out here recently with the implosion of the submersible, it was a much from the initial press reports. I developed the impression this was kind of something that was done quickly, and obviously there were some flaws with the technology. I mean that's self-evident. But this was a long developing business plan by the founder of the company, again, Stockton Rush. And the cast of characters of the 5 people that wasn't coincidental. This was the business plan. So Rush was the pilot. He had some well-heeled people, the billionaire and the Pakistani man and his son. Then there's the historian. This was Rush's business plan because he was interested in underwater exploration and technologies of what the minerals and the biomedical potential for underwater exploration. But he's not government funded. So there's an interesting analogy with what he attempted to do and what Jeff Bezos and Branson and Elon Musk. There's kind of an interesting little story there too, because I mean, should the government be the only ones doing this? There's obvious in terms of the space development, clearly we're moving towards a private enterprise model. Part of the subtext that criticizes the whole enterprise, that there were some rich people, and Bezos and Musk, they come in for their share of mocking and all of this as well. But this was his plan to make deep sea underwater exploration possible. He or someone else would pilot. There'd be a few well-heeled people who would pay for it, but there would be a scientist or an explorer, a marine biologist or historian.
It wasn't just a fun excursion.
There was a
scientific aspect to it also.
Yes, and so you can criticize the business model, I suppose, but you have to ask yourself, what's the alternative? What other alternatives did he have if he wanted to pursue this vision?
We'll come back to the billionaire tourism aspect of it in the second portion of today's program. I'm talking with David Nicandri, formerly the director of the Washington State Historical Society and the author of a number of books, some on Lewis and Clark and a couple on Captain James Cook. We'll come back to that too. So Dave, let's review again. So this is a submersible. These have to be built with extraordinary tensile strength because of the pressure. This was a kind of a non-standard material. It was a kind of a synthetic material. There were people who had warned that this was a potentially very dangerous material to use. It had gone down dozens of times, so it had proved itself. But several people that I saw interviewed said that they had been in it and had heard noises and had felt that the pressures were starting to really damage the hull of this thing. It's sort of like a lozenge. It's not perfectly spheroid. And so that adds some pressures because the sphere is the best pressure to withstand that, and steel is the best material.
Mm-hmm. Which this was neither.
This was neither. These guys go down and they get about an hour and 45 minutes down into what's a little over a 2-hour descent. And at that point, they lose contact with the mothership, which is up above, the Polar Prince. The experts on the inside immediately realized that something catastrophic had happened, and probably an implosion. But that knowledge was withheld from the public in the hopes that there would be a chance of rescue. And we all watched as time went on and their oxygen levels would have run out and so on. There was kind of an Apollo 13 mania that set in. How long could they survive and how ingenious could they possibly be? There are investigations going on. There are also rescue submersibles pulling pieces of the hull off of the floor. I read the other day that the whole response apparatus of the searches, the submersibles that went down looking for them, now to pick up pieces of it, to do the intensive mapping of the floor, to see if they can find every piece of this, that this might run to $100 million.
Yeah, that's incredible.
$100 million. Just keep in mind, Lewis and Clark had a budget of $2,500, and they spent about $35,000, which would, of course, be infinitely larger today.
Sure,
but
with inflation.
This is going to be one of the most expensive disaster aftermaths in history. Let's take a quick break. I'm talking with David Nicandri. When I come back, I want to ask you two things. One is about billionaire tourism, and secondly, about the response of former President Barack Obama to this disaster. You're listening to America with Clay Jenkinson. Welcome back to Listening to America. I'm with my friend Dave Nicandri. Literally, we often talk by Zoom these days, but here we are in a hotel in Missoula, Montana, and it's an atrium hotel, so we can look down at our friends from the Lewis and Clark world who have their badges and their name tags, and they're meeting this morning. There are a series of lectures tonight. The banquet speech at this 55th annual conference is the great Dan Flores.
Yeah, that's quite a coup.
He's the author of The Natural West. He's the author of American Serengeti. He's the author of Coyote America. He's an extraordinary scholar, and I have to say, I feel like, in a sense, I discovered him because you'll recall I interviewed him for WPO a couple of years ago, and he said the most amazing thing. I said, imagine yourself descending in a hot air balloon into central Montana in 1804. He said, okay. I said, now look around and tell me what you see. And he talked about grizzly bears and bison, wolves and coyotes and bighorn sheep and mountain goats and pronghorn antelope, and then native peoples living in a somewhat nomadic way, and no river had ever been dammed, no acre of land had ever been plowed.
It was a Garden of Eden.
It was Edenic. We have to be careful with that trope, of course.
Yes.
We've learned that unfortunately we have to be careful with that sort of metaphor, but it was Edenic, and that's why I think that's one reason why there's such a profound nostalgia in the American spirit for that era.
Well, and it's why people here, following Lewis and Clark, find exploration history interesting, because that's an opening onto what that world was like at the point of contact, which of course at the very moment of the encounter, that world changes. And from a native indigenous perspective, it changes permanently and disastrously forever. But it's that opportunity to look into a lost world, as it were. That's why people follow Lewis and Clark, because they had a perspective, they had a lens on what that Edenic world was like. People are fascinated by it. There's always kind of a sense of loss, longing, wishfulness about wouldn't it be nice to be able to experience that oneself. And I think that's part of what draws people to meetings like the one we're at.
It's on the whole really admirable that we continue to fixate on America in 1492 or America in 1804. And what we need to realize is that Native Americans are people like other people, and they sometimes damage their environment, and they fought wars, and they had the problems that humans have. Their technology was so much less potent that the amount of damage they could do was almost infinitely less.
Correct.
But we need to avoid making them a kind of a super Edenic people too, right?
Yes, and they took great pleasure and routinely changed the environment to their own ends constantly.
As one does.
Yeah, as one does, exactly.
All right, so speaking of nostalgia, the Titanic went down in 1912.
Yes.
What's the thing about the Titanic? What is the thing about our national obsession with the Titanic?
Well, we can talk about Ocean Gate and Stockton Rush and the billionaire, but the underlying premise is equally fascinating. Because what is the hold of the Titanic? I mean, this guy, he had a choice of shipwrecks. I mean, if he's looking for underwater tourism, probably couldn't do what our friend Menson Bound tried to do. We talked about that in a recent issue. With the Endurance, or Sir John Franklin, much more accessible. But there's something about the story of the Titanic that draws people, and I think it's the combination of technology, wealth, affluence, and all of that kind of crashing to nothingness, or
the unsinkability. That we thought that the industrial paradigm had become impervious to risk.
Yeah, and of course, that's an ironic subtext to the collapse of the submersible. It's the combination of affluence, technology, and the amalgamated hubris that's a function of all of that.
Would you, if you were a billionaire,
have taken that?
Have taken one of these excursions?
If it were me personally, maybe. I mean, it's hard to say.
It's not the top of your list.
It's not the top of my list. I mean, I like the shore of water and land as opposed to being out in deep water and in deep water. But and all of the same elements are at play with the submersible.
5 people are dead. They signed these waivers that apparently were like many pages long, saying you might be killed, you might well be killed. Do you realize you might be killed?
You have to sign a waiver to go on the bus tour at this convention.
Right. Where maybe you're more likely to be killed. But you get my point. These people knew going in that they had a reasonable chance of survival, a pretty good chance of survival. Otherwise, they wouldn't have done it. But that there was a significant possibility that something could go terribly wrong.
Well, clarify for me, Clay. Had this submersible gone to the Titanic on previous
Many
voyages?
times.
Okay, so this was not the first.
No, this is not an experiment.
Okay.
You can afford to pay $250,000. That's nothing. That's like you and I maybe buying a bicycle or something. Does it bother you at all that there are many billionaires, of course, and they kind of shop for luxury adventures that average people could never under any circumstance afford, and they probably look at a menu, like go to the Antarctic, suborbital flight now. So if you spend $250,000, that's at least 3 times the average salary of an American worker who works very hard.
Right.
Does any of this trouble you?
It doesn't bother me. I think I understand the rationale and the context of those people's lives, why they do it. It's easy to criticize as an extravagance, as they're being. I mean, you hear people suggest, well, there's an emptiness to their lives, and they're looking for some thrills to gain some excitement.
I think that's very condescending.
Yeah, but that's
what people have said.
Yeah, and
I don't think we can judge what their motives are.
But my point, what I found interesting in the whole episode, is that both within the context of the Titanic, which is the underwater context within which this takes place, but the broad pattern of exploration dating perhaps back to the days of Marco Polo, certainly the era of the Enlightenment, there's always been an element of where the affluent and their interests and fascinations at sometimes mere hobbies comes into play. And so
most famously, in my mind, Joseph Banks.
Absolutely.
Who was a wealthy gentleman, scientist, amateur,
yes,
in London, kind of a patron of scientific inquiry and exploration, who got himself on Captain Cook's first voyage, and actually, in some sense, overtook it in the public's imagination.
No question. And bought his way on and attempted for the second voyage until Banks had gotten so full of himself that Cook realized, because of improvements, whole structures were being built on the ship, and Cook realized that the ship was becoming unseaworthy because of all the improvements Banks had dictated. He ordered them taken down, and in a fit of pique, Banks withdrew. And
I'm talking to Dave Nicandri. We're in a hotel in Missoula, Montana. It's an absolutely perfect early summer. I'm looking forward to hearing Dan Flores tonight, and my young friend Kevin O'Brien is giving a talk on indigenous maps. Lots of exciting things, plus some field trips. But we're talking about the submersible Ocean Gate expeditions, the Titan. Here's an irony. This Henri, maybe the most serious intellectual of the group that went down and died.
Unquestionably.
He had done some very, very amazing things. And he has the contract for exclusive reclamation of objects from the Titanic. He's apparently was obsessed with the Titanic, collected more than 5,000 objects from it. There's an irony here that the Titan, in search of the Titanic, went down within 1,600 feet of the Titanic. That, in a sense, it's a parallel, right?
Yes. Yeah, there are many. And, of course, both the Titanic and Titan, the search vessel, what went searching for the Titanic. And you would know this better. Those terms that have origins in Greek mythology. I'm sure you could go check.
The Titan gods, right?
You could go check.
We tend to name exploration. The Odyssey was one of the rescue vessels.
Yes. What I found interesting in doing a little background research on this, of course, the ship that's imploded, or the craft that imploded, that was a second generation vessel. The original one was called the Antipodes, which was a term that immediately resonated with me because of the work I've done on Captain Cook, who went searching, actually didn't go searching for the Antipodes, but I think he manufactured his course, so he made sure he found the exact opposite place on the Earth,
and
opposite from Greenwich.
What's an antipode for those who don't know?
Well, an antipode is an equally opposite place on the Earth. If you're at 50 degrees north, 10 degrees west, you want to know where 50 degrees south, 10 degrees east is. That's the concept. And that was not coincidental that Stockton Rush named his prototype the Antipodes. And that's fully emblematic of the grand sweep of nautical and maritime history. That's the part of this story that I find most fascinating, is the echoes, the rhymes. That's what appeals to me.
So, naming is so important. If they had named that vessel the Taylor Swift, it wouldn't be the same, right? You have to think of the name that somehow fits the adventure, the intensity of the thing. You want to place yourself in some ancient mythological names.
Yes.
Or you might have called it the Endurance, although that's probably a bad idea.
Yeah. Well, the names of all the craft on the Apollo mission were all deeply resonant with exploration history, discovery, and endeavor. There may have been an Endurance somewhere along the way. I'm not sure. So these are not coincidental. And I'm not trying to glorify Stockton Rush or any of the people. And this is kind of presaging getting to President Obama's comment. I think the selective outrage about what people of wealth do or are capable of doing, that's what I find.
You want to resist that?
I think, yes, that's what I find obnoxious about what he did in this particular instance, because...
What former President Obama did.
Yes.
We'll come back to his statement here shortly. But you don't like the kind of easy way of dismissing these people as snobs who are throwing money around.
There's plenty to criticize about this whole venture. Putting people in harm's way when maybe he knew better. I mean, just putting people's lives.
He wouldn't have known better because he was on the vessel, so he had to assume.
He was put his own life on the line.
He didn't send a lackey down there.
And that is a very important point worth denoting here. I agree.
Let me ask this question: in terms of disasters, the Challenger disaster, January 28th, 1986. I remember where I was.
Me too.
The Apollo 1 disaster when it burned on the pad, January 27, 1967.
My freshman year of college.
I was.
Me too.
And the nation went into a 2-year wringing of hands over this.
Yes.
Then the Columbia space shuttle disaster, February 1st, 2003, 7 astronauts, as there were 7 on the Challenger.
This doesn't compare to those, though.
No, where will this fit?
Well, it's a minor league catastrophe. The sensation kind of reflects a little bit of the modern news cycle requirement for things to talk about, which is a whole discussion in itself. So this kind of fit in conveniently over a weekend when maybe not much else of importance was going on. I think this will pretty quickly pass by. I don't think people will be saying 20 years from now.
Where were you?
I remember when the Titan went down looking for the Titanic. So I think in that sense it's pretty ephemeral, but it does offer a moment of reflection on our own time and culture.
Every year, Dave Nicandri, on Mount Everest, which is also now a rich person's excursion, because I could never afford it, and I don't think you could, even with your colossal book sales. Every year, between 5 and 10 people die on Everest, and we don't. They get a tiny story.
If that,
page 37 in the New York Times.
It's almost become a commonplace.
Right, and so it has become a commonplace that this is a risk. You may die. People often go that are not really right for it. You can't say that of a submersible.
No.
We've routinized death in certain adventures. People die every year on Mount Whitney, certainly on Everest and the other top peaks in the world. And we no longer wring our hands much over that. This is kind of new to us, isn't it?
The Everest comparison, I think, that's a different kettle of fish to mix metaphors a little bit. Exploration has gone through a phase of amalgamation where our favorite aspect of it is the Enlightenment quest. The search,
you and I.
Yeah, the search for knowledge and understanding about the cosmos.
Captain Cook in Tahiti.
Yes.
1769.
Or Darwin,
right.
For example.
These are our templates.
Yes, but then but since then, beginning about Darwin's time, but mostly thereafter, and certainly into the modern time, there's kind of this romantic overlay to travel and exploration, and there is where I think exploration and related endeavors, that's where it really gets problematic, with the romantic overlay. We can go into that in greater detail.
We have a couple of minutes. Let's get former President Barack Obama on and off the table. So I watched this, and I want to say that the best coverage was Fox. I'm a little surprised, but it was really, Brett Baer did a tremendous job as anchor, because there's a delicacy to this. We don't know whether they're dead yet. We don't want to get ahead of this story. The news is coming in a glacial way. You have to fill hour after hour. He did a superb job, and he had great guests on. Meanwhile, in another interview unrelated to this, former President Obama said something like this: "This is an inevitable fixation, and I understand that. But at the same time, 700 people drowned as refugees in the Mediterranean near Greece on their way to Italy from the Middle East. This got
The previous week, right?
almost no attention whatsoever in American newspapers. He said, there's something wrong here. He said, and then he went on to say, apropos of wealth, he said, it is hard to maintain a republic when you have this sort of aggrandizement of wealth in the hands of a few people, that this is really toxic for the idea of a democracy. So not only was he talking about the 1% and the 99% and the disproportionality of our interest in these wealthy individuals, but he was also saying, doesn't the world need to give more attention to the truly desperate people who are on voyages, in some sense, much more dangerous than this?
And of course he's right.
But it bothered you.
But yes, because it was a cheap shot. Well, first, as a technical matter, I mean, these wealthy people, none of them were Americans. I don't think the owner of the company was particularly wealthy.
Right.
Well, the Harding, Hamish Harding was British. The Pakistanis, by definition, are not Americans. The other fellow is the
Frenchman is not.
Frenchman's probably of relatively modest means. This I thought was so typical of President Obama, the weakest aspect of his presidency. I mean, the space program virtually died under his aegis. We're only now beginning to make some catch-up.
It wasn't one of his interests.
It wasn't one of his interests. He's internally oriented, and I think the best part of humanity. And there are problems. I'm not gainsaying the fact that was a tragedy, and the whole plight of migrants across the world's surface is a problem that needs to be addressed, and it does need more attention. But there's nothing to be gained by mocking people who are trying to extend the boundaries of science. I just thought it was a cheap shot of sorts, and unnecessary, and he should have had maybe more sympathy for the plight of these people, particularly this young boy who, as press accounts since have elucidated, may or may not have wanted to go on this expedition. And having traveled with my son, as you have traveled with your daughter, that those kinds of thoughts, what would I ever do that with my son? I can't imagine having the wealth to do so. But my son and I are planning our Rocky Mountain trip, and he's running by some of these dangerous roads we're going to be on, and he's asking me, are you comfortable going on this road from southeastern Idaho across the Teton Range into Wyoming? And I thought about it, and I looked at it, and I said, okay, let's do it. So these are the kinds of calculations people go through.
Beyond the reach of the AAA.
Yes.
So I want to just defend Barack Obama as we go to break. He never says anything that I don't want to listen to. He's an extremely thoughtful and intelligent man. He has a very strong sense of justice. I don't think that he was out of bounds. I think it was maybe not good timing.
Yeah.
But he did say that he had deep respect for these individuals, and he understood adventure and so on. It was a disproportionality question for him. And I think the fact that he raised it, even if it annoys you or annoys me, is still important. That we have to wrestle with that question.
The dialogue is important, and I don't want to suggest it was entirely out of bounds. I just thought that from a man whose presidency always seemed to discount scientific endeavor and the space program in particular, for him to take this particular shot was a little over the top.
I think the word you used is cheap shot. I'm talking with David Nicandri. We'll take a quick break. When we come back, I want to ask you many more questions about the disaster of the submersible Titan, 13,000 feet at the bottom of the Atlantic Ocean, within range, about a quarter of a mile, of the hull of the Titanic. We'll be back in just a minute. I'm talking with my friend David Nicandri about exploration, and in particular the implosion catastrophe of the submersible Titan in June of 2023. We're still thinking about it, the rescue of the missions to bring back portions of the vessel, and at least possibly small human remains continues. It's going to be enormously expensive, but it probably does in some way contribute to the future. When Apollo 1 burned on top of the rocket in 1967, the astronauts and engineers redesigned the Apollo capsule, and they made it safer.
2 years worth of work.
And it was, there was some question of whether the space program would survive. It certainly probably wouldn't have survived a second fire at that time. So this led to...
And this is all under deadline to get to the moon before the decade is out.
Thank you, JFK. An almost impossible deadline, and we made it. Mm-hmm. So these disasters are not just too bad. We can wring our hands. We do learn from them. And I'm guessing that there will be lawsuits now, of course, because almost immediately I heard...
The wife of the Pakistani fellow especially.
Almost immediately, Dave, I heard people saying they should have known better. This synthetic material was unreliable, that there had been explicit warnings, there had been group letters by underwater experts to OceanGate saying, you might want to retire that vessel, etc. So, of course, there will be lawsuits now. And that can have an ameliorative effect, too, because it will force people to rethink some of this. So here's an easy question. You get down there, I tried to imagine myself in this cramped quarter, like a Volkswagen.
Looking out of a portal.
And there's a 3-inch thick portal, and there are cameras, and there are lights, but it's murky. When I saw the pictures of the Endurance, when you actually see what was discovered in the Weddell Sea,
yep.
You see kind of a shadowy, silhouette-y thing covered with undersea dust. And I'm guessing when you get down to 13,000 feet, the thrill is the intellectual idea that I'm there rather than what you actually get to see, which is probably not much.
I think that's probably right. And it's the equivalent of summiting a mountain, I suppose, to say you've done it. It's too bad this happened, and it could be a tremendous setback to underwater exploration. But there's so little of it being done. I mean, that's the tragedy. I mean, you compare and I'm not having already criticized the fact we don't invest as much in the space program as we should. NASA's budget is now $10 billion. NOAA's $50 million by comparison.
50 million versus 10 billion.
10 billion. We've spent 300 hours on the moon. We've spent 3 hours at the deepest part of
the Mariana Trench.
The Mariana Trench. And that's what Stockton Rush was trying to do. He was trying to make the deep underwater more familiar so that people would become more interested in the potential. In a way, Clay, it's kind of what John C. Fremont was trying to do with his expeditions. If you're out there and you explain, terrain can be difficult, there's human problems you need to manage, but if you make it accessible and familiar, people will follow. So that's what he was attempting to do.
I want to stop you just to challenge that a little bit. I think you're overselling it. Yes, of course. You don't do this unless there's a deep fascination, because it's expensive, it's dangerous, the logistics are very complicated and time-consuming and so on. But he was in it partly for science, and of course greatly for money, that this was a business, and he realized that there are enough gazillionaires that you can do this on an ongoing basis.
Yes.
So there's a commercial aspect to this that I don't discount. I don't think that this disaster will slow down undersea exploration much. I think it actually might accelerate it.
Perhaps, we'll see, yeah. But again, these are the parallels in history that come to mind when we talk about such things as this. So let's take a terrestrial analog. The Hudson Bay Company had a charter to trap out the continental interior, Hudson Bay, south and west.
Purely commercial with some science on the bottom.
Yes. But the Northwest Company, which had no charter, was kind of a bootstrap operation, free traders. They coalesce into their own company, and they're doing their own thing without any say. In fact, at times it gets to be a war between the chartered monopoly, Hudson Bay, and the Northwest Company. But the best explorers, Clay, were people like Peter Pond and Alexander Mackenzie.
David Thompson.
Working for the Northwest Company. They're Peter Fiedler and some other people of note worked for the Hudson Bay Company. But they were following the lead of the explorer adventurers, I'll call them, of which Stockton Rush was a type.
When Lewis and Clark left St. Louis on May 14th, 1804, they could not count on any supply. They had to essentially take with them everything they thought they might need. There was a chance that there might be a ship at the mouth of the Columbia, but they couldn't count on that. So it was really a payload problem. They were not passive. They were moving those boats on the backs of the thighs and the back muscles. in the arms of these brawny young men, mostly bachelors in their early 20s. They earned every single mile they made. If I'm a rich person who buys a trip on a suborbital flight, or if I'm a rich person who buys a descent in one of these submersibles, it's passive. I'm a passenger. I might have a recorder and make some notes. I might publish an article about it. I might do some interviews afterwards. But you're passive. That's a change. And when the Apollo astronauts would land on the moon, the telemetry gathered more data probably per minute than Lewis and Clark published in a lifetime, right?
Yep.
And the astronauts were dependent upon Isaac Newton and engineers back in Houston. They were not flying the ship in any Captain Cook-like sense, were they?
No, not at all. They brought back some samples from the moon and geology, and of course there's great interest in going back to the moon. And Elon Musk is always talking about going to Mars, but and I'm just trying to give Stockton Rush his due. As I say, he's a figure easy to mock and criticize, but there's aspects of what he was trying to do that I think are salutary. And ultimately what he was trying to do was point to the same kinds of potential that are commonly talked about in terms of what might be gained from rare lunar minerals or rare minerals on Mars, or even the life raft scenario. And part of what Musk talks about as a subtext is we need to make an investment in deep space exploration. And Rush talked about the fact that he kind of granted the plausibility of that premise, but suggested maybe the place to do it is not on a different planet, which is going to be very difficult to get to, which presents its own problems, as he learned with his own demise. One of the well-known phenomenon of mariners, and it fascinated them from Cook earlier and since, bioluminescence.
Yes.
So imagine injecting bioluminescent features to track down cancer cells in the body. This is ultimately what Stockton Rush was aiming at. He might have had a flawed business model. He might have put other people in his own life at risk. But the notion that there was nothing to be gained by fostering an interest in underwater exploration is mistaken.
And I think you're going to say that if the Titanic is the magnet that makes that happen,
So be it.
So
be it.
Now,
Correct.
that's not what you would go see,
No, I'd go see John Franklin's ship,
which has been found.
which has been found up in the Canadian North, and of
Or
course,
the Endurance.
That has its own set of problems because the ocean is covered by layers of ice. We talked about
You
that.
can barely
briefly.
find an opening.
You can barely find an opening. But if I were, that's the kind of thing.
You want to place it in terms of history of exploration. The Titanic is not an exploration vessel.
The exploration is just simply a means to an end. There's kind of a mystique to the Titanic, and Rush just kind of capitalized on it as a way of raising money for his. He could have issued stock, I suppose, or he could have tried to bootstrap the operation by selling tickets to go down, thrill seekers or otherwise. So there's a difference between his passengers and his motivation. His motivation and Narjaleh, they're in a different category of enterprise than the two Pakistani fellows and Hamish Harding, the billionaire. They're seeking thrills. The other two are using the paying passengers in order to further their scientific ends and ambitions. There's the romantic quality of what's at play here. The first, the most. Exploration or travel by superlative, to be the first to do something, to go to the highest place. That's what summiting these mountains is about. That's not Enlightenment science. That's human romance. And I'm not saying one is necessarily better than the other. I think each are understandable in themselves, and they do get amalgamated. But they are separate ventures. So there was kind of the Enlightenment side to the Titan, and then there was what I would call the romantic travel aspect. They happen to be in the same craft, but they're pursuing different ends. And I think that got lost sight of in this story.
I agree with you. I think most of us regarded it as a feat. And that does trouble me some.
Yes.
Because they were buying something that they knew average people can never do.
Yeah,
and that's going to be a cocktail party cachet for the rest of their lives.
And that, I think, is what President Obama was criticizing justifiably. If I could fine-tune my criticism of the former president, was he threw all five of them into the same kettle. And I think there are separate motivations at play here, which, because it was easy to criticize it all as of a piece, and maybe he wasn't so much criticizing the people in the submersible, he was criticizing
the media,
popular media interest in it.
I know you want to quote from The Little Prince, so go ahead.
in the literature around this, I found a quote. So Antoine de Saint-Exupéry, who was an aviator,
a great
actually,
aviator,
died at sea.
Happened to write The Little Prince, which became the world's memory of him.
Yes. So I came upon a quote I identify with in it from an armchair sense. Because I said earlier, I'm not.
You're a shoreman.
Yeah, I'm a shoreman. I mean, I got seasick going across the Strait of Juan de Fuca.
You dipped your toe in the Arctic.
And I dipped my toe in the Arctic. But there's a quote attributed to Saint-Exupéry that I think is germane here.
Let's hear it.
And it's attributed to him, although maybe it's an adaptation from what he probably wrote. And he said, if you want to build a ship, don't drum up the men to gather wood, divide the wood, or give orders. Instead, teach them to yearn for the vast and endless sea. And I think there again, that's where the romance and the allure ventures like this, going back into ancient times through Captain Cook, Darwin, now to Stockton Rush, the allure of the sea. It's a thing.
And I'm kind of channeling my inner Cousteau. When we were children, it was the French undersea man, Cousteau.
Yeah, so was Cousteau an explorer or an adventurer, Clay?
Some of each, but he was more explorer.
I would
than,
agree.
Certainly not commercial, although
Yes.
there was a commercial aspect to what he did. But he was like the Carl Sagan of the sea, saying, "It's there. It's infinitely interesting. We should do more with it, and we need to protect certain species in it." And I just want to make sure everyone remembers that these undersea excursions have discovered new invertebrates.
Yes.
Hundreds of them, and there are hundreds of thousands of species yet not cataloged in the sea.
Well, because we used the space program as a counterpoint and analog to all of this. So William Anders, who was on Apollo 8, which was the Christmas Eve.
My favorite of all the missions, the reading of the book of Genesis from around the moon,
and
1968.
And he one day he was talking about that famous photograph, the Earthrise.
Earthrise.
As they come around the moon, suddenly the Earth pops out in front of them, and they take a famous picture, which has created a whole psychological effect. It's called the overview effect. But this is just a great quote from Anders, and let me, if I might share it. We came all this way to explore the moon, and the most important thing we discovered was the Earth.
Right. So I've read about that moment in countless books. So they didn't know it was coming. I mean, they knew that they would be able to see the Earth, but they didn't have an idea that this phenomenon was really going to be as impressive as it was. And suddenly there it is. And they have these tiny little windows, and they have these Hasselblad cameras. And Frank Borman, the commander, was a very no-nonsense guy. Didn't want them doing anything that wasn't on the chart. No funny business. And so he's always blaming Anders for taking too many pictures. So Anders says, "You might want to look at this one, Frank." And then Frank says, "Give me a camera." And and then there's a dispute about who actually took the photo. It may have been Borman.
Really? Okay.
There was a dispute, as usual. But it turned out to be one of the most famous photographs ever taken.
Yes.
And it creates what's called the overview effect, by which we mean, oh, look, you can't tell where the West Bank ends and Israel begins. Why can't people get along? These boundaries are entirely artificial. They're invisible from space, etc.
It was, since Genesis was read that night, it was a Genesis-like moment in terms of human perception of our homeland, referring to the whole planet now.
I remember hearing it on Christmas Eve, 1968, in front of a black and white television set in Jenkinson, North Dakota, with my parents. And we were not particularly active Christians. My father was an atheist. My mother was nominal Christian. And when they started to read that, I thought this is one of the greatest moments in my life, certainly, and one of the greatest moments in history. That they chose a perfect text on Christmas Eve to bring the world into the moment that they were in, and for us to ask cosmological questions.
Yes, I don't think...
Fantastic. 5 human beings died. A vast array of technology and rescue teams came to the scene, including the U.S. Coast Guard. The world's attention, at least the attention of the American people, was riveted for about 72 hours. I think people hoped against hope that they would somehow have survived, and then when we learned that they didn't, it was sort of like, well, in a sense, we knew that all along. And questions get asked about regulation and what sort of vessels should be licensed. One of the most amazing things for me was hearing James Cameron the director of the Titanic. I don't know what I thought of him, but not much. He's the real item. I mean, he's fascinated. He knows what he's talking about. He was interviewed for about 20 minutes, and it was flawlessly articulate, wise, thoughtful. He criticized the Ocean Gate people a little, but in a very modulated way. I had no idea, did you, that he was that serious an undersea guy?
No, I just thought he was a movie maker.
Yeah, I saw him at the Oscars
yes.
saying, "I'm king of the world now." And it rubbed me the wrong way, but now I take him very seriously. What's your takeaway from this story in a nutshell?
Well, it all comes back to humanity's quest for meaning, its future,
The restlessness of the human soul.
restlessness of the human spirit, absolutely. And I mean, I'm a student of this. I mean, I can't imagine. I mean, I dabble put my toe in the water of adventures, all terrestrial in nature. But I have great admiration for people who put themselves out at the extremity. We're drawn to them because of their either bravery or foolishness, maybe some combination of both. But I just like telling the stories about the people who are explorers. I think it's one of the noblest aspects of the human species, wanting to learn more, wanting to gather new experiences. I know because it's on the Listening to America webpage. I'll yield to you to give the quote, but it's T.S. Eliot's famous phrase, which I think sums things up beautifully, and I'll ask you to recapitulate it, Clay.
Well,
I think it's a good way to
It's in
conclude
the four
things.
quartets and Little Gidding, which I love Eliot's work. He, of course, wrote The Wasteland and the love song of J. Alfred Prufrock, but this is from the four quartets, a late work. He says, we'll continue to explore until we finally come back to the place where we began and know it for the first time. And that I'm not quite sure what it even means, but I know it means a lot, right? He got it. He nailed it somehow.
Yeah.
That and it's what Anders said too. In Apollo 8, you go to these places thinking that that's the thing.
And you discover something else.
Yourself,
Exactly.
or your homeland, or an insight that you could not otherwise have had.
Precisely. That's a great linkage, Clay. I think you tied it up beautifully.
Thank you, David Nicandri. We'll continue to follow this story. It's fascinating. I love it that you're the Enlightenment correspondent on Listening to America, as you were before on the Thomas Jefferson Hour. We'll see you all next week for another important edition of Listening to America with Clay Jenkinson.